So this is a talk about data. And if you're a data fan, I think you'll find it quite stimulating and illuminating. And if you're not, well, you could take your break. The scope of what I want to look at is how do things change in the internet, particularly security-wise? How should we think about that? What are our good mental models? And I have a whole ton of data to illustrate different facets of this, and I'm going to walk through kind of chronologically. I will finish with the modern era. Don't worry about that. But we start way back in the day, 1990s. Yesterday's talk was a great reminder for those of us who went through that whole trajectory of vulnerability hunting, disclosures, that evolution. That's its own evolution. It's its own time scale. It's really interesting. Here we're going to talk about searching for invariance. So I started my career as a PhD student analyzing the internet, and I picked a great time for it, which was the early to mid 90s, a lot of stuff happening. And one thing you wanted to find, because everything changed so fast, is, well, what are the things that don't change? And sometimes the things that don't change are the rules about how things change, and that's part of what we'll be covering today. So let me start with data. This is data gathered by Rick Adams, who is one of the founders of a company, UUNet, you may or may not know. And it is, what is the volume of data per day going through the Usenet bulletin board system? Old system, peer-to-peer delivery of news groups, kind of like Reddit is today, though more decentralized. And because it's peer-to-peer, you can measure the entire thing. And UUNet ran one of the big nodes in the bulletin board network, and so he had this data. He was a data nerd, like I am. And it goes way back, right? We're talking 80s, not even the 90s. And you look at this data, and at first you think, well, okay, nothing much happened for the entire 80s, and then around 1992, maybe things started picking up. And that might be how you look at it. And if that's how you look at it, you're actually missing something really interesting about the data. And you see that if you plot it not linear, which is what this is, but log linear. So that's this. And suddenly we've gone from a curve that kind of picks up at the end to something that looks like a straight line. When you plot and you see straight lines, you learn the hard way you better fit a line to it, because sometimes it's not a straight line. So here's the fit. That's least squares fit. And for real data across a decade, it's a very good fit. In fact, there's those wonky dropouts pretty much exactly every 12 months, and that's the end of year holidays. So this is showing a log linear relationship. And what does it mean when it's a straight line on a log scale plot? It's exponential growth. How fast is the growth? It's the slope of the line. Well, what is it? It's 80% a year. So this data is showing that this facet of the internet not only was growing exponentially in the 90s, but in the 80s, it was growing exponentially. And in fact, if you had to pick an invariant, it would be it grows 80% a year. Really striking that goes that far back. And so I love this data. I was working on characterizing internet traffic in various ways, and I really wanted to know what comes next. What happened after 94? Because that's the data Rick gave me, was 84 to 94. And unfortunately, from a sort of greedy researcher perspective, Rick had a hugely successful company. And it meant when his aux script broke in 1994 that generated this, he didn't ever bother finding the time to fix it. And that was like, oh, what a lost opportunity, because you want to know, that's crazy growth, 80% a year. Could that be sustained? And then 2 years later, a guy at UUNet got back to me and said, I've got a few data points from 1996. What are they going to show? Does that 80% a year start tailing off? Seemed it had to. And here's what he showed me. It's those 2 extra points And now I have a real problem, because I really want to know, do I believe that? Did the decade-long invariant of 80% growth a year change? And if it did, how could it possibly have gone up, not down? So this is a problem, right? It's so easy to think that David Lawrence's data was just different. And it would have remained a gnawing puzzle, except the fact there were two data sets. One of them was bytes per day, which I'm showing you here, and one of them was articles per day. And if I plot articles per day, the data fits. So that is a 75% year growth, which means articles slowly over time get bigger, kind of what you'd expect. And this is not, proof of the pudding that the change is correct, that the new data is correct, but it's certainly plausible because it kept the invariant. Now, once you've got one thing continues growing 75% a year and another grows faster, well, what happened? Articles got bigger. So this is the average size of articles. And you can see that, for a decade, they were basically sitting there at 2 kilobytes. And then suddenly they're, 15, 20 kilobytes. And where my career sort of shifted at this time, due to this and other things too, is that's abuse. That extra change was driven by two things. It was driven by porn, and it was driven by stolen software, wares. And both of those are not what the people providing this system were doing it for. They did not, this is not why they wanted to provide it. It's definitely counter to their intent. So it's abuse. This shows you can get this big change over a small amount of time driven by security things. And it drove it counter to the direction we would have expected. Okay, that was the 1990s. Let's move up to the 2000s, the aughts, whatever we want to call it. And we're going to see things can change really quickly. So here's some data at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Now that's where I was working when I was in work study PhD. A whole bunch of the data we're going to see in this talk comes from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. There was mention at the beginning of the Zeek, open source Zeek. I developed that originally while working at Lawrence Berkeley Lab and a grad student at Berkeley. And the data, other than that first set of data, all the data we're going to see from now on is derived from Zeek deployments. And a brief context for Zeek, rich network monitoring tells you in detail all the activity that's been seen. It's essentially what you need to know about it, passive monitoring. Okay, so this is data at LBL that started in 1994 when I was first prototyping what turned into Zeek. And it is how many hosts per day we're scanning the lab. And you look at the data and you say, well, for 6 years it was, I don't know, around 50. It's a little hard to tell with that log scale. And then it started going up a bit. We've got growth. And then it literally changed overnight. July 19th, 2001, looked like that. July 20th, it looked like that. So in one day, this facet of how security was experienced in Lawrence Berkeley Lab changed by 2 orders of magnitude. And it never went back. And maybe some of you who were active back in the day recognize that date. That is the beginning of the modern worm era. That was code red, July 20th. So suddenly we've got a global worm, it's scanning globally, and boom, tens of thousands of hosts are scanning every single day instead of 100 or 200. And then it goes down a bit in over 2002 and 3, and then back up to a peak, and then we get the cybercrime era. So this data is pretty fascinating as well. It shows these sort of both this abrupt change and then these large swings that are over more time. At the time, with colleagues, I found this data really interesting, and we analyzed, well, what's being scanned? And here you see over 12 years, how many scans are coming proportionally by the circle size for different services. And you see all sorts of wonky dynamics in this. I'm not going to go into this in particular, though. I really do like that 9898 Sasser backdoor. That's parasitic malware looking for backdoor left by other malware. And you see that scanning just suddenly starts abruptly in 2004 and starts tailing off. The question then, that was a view all the way up through 2006. So by now, we've looked at a couple decades. What follows? What's happened in the last 18 years? And it turns out that Lawrence Berkeley Lab, which trained me well as a, I'm a data nerd. They are data nerds. They are data pack rats. And so we're wondering, how does this evolve? Now here, I've switched to connections per day. Similar figure, it's not conditioned on scanners. And I have data. And it's from these folks at Lawrence Berkeley Lab who are in the part of the security team. And guess what? They've recorded everything all the way back to 1984, and they still have it. So here is what the data looks like. And we're going to take a few looks at this, and then we'll start switching to evolution security technology. So first off, I don't know if you could see that little blue thing in the lower left. That was this craziness. There it is. And if we look at this, log scaled, we can kind of break it down into a few regions. By the way, those drop-offs, that's just measurement problem. That's not some deep effect. And if you fit least squares to some regions, you go, well, from 94 up to, 2006, 7, connections per day were growing 73% a year. And then kind of slowed from 2010 to 2022, maybe to 50-odd%. And lately, it's down to 12. And before you dismiss those numbers too much, just keep in mind, we're talking years. These are many years. And continuous data. So in millions, billions of points go into that. So it's actually pretty robust. Let me switch a bit from connections to remote hosts. So how many remote hosts are coming to the lab? Here it is up through about 2008, linear scale. And it's not doing a lot, and then there's a little bit of growth. Whoa, interesting. And then, some kind of noisy craziness, and then boop. So in 2023, it just jumps. And you're kind of like, what on earth is that? And, can it possibly be right? And, I'll give you a preview. Yeah, it's correct. And what does it mean? And we'll get back to what it means in a minute. But let me first draw your eye to that point. So on that day, almost 1% of the entire IPv4 address space came to the lab. And this is not backscatter and randomized addresses, because you can tell, because they're going for well-known ports at the lab, and that's not what you see in backscatter. You see it going to the ephemerals used for the backscatter. And as part of thinking about how things change or don't change, let's reflect on that. It was IPv4. I like this quote a lot from William Gibson. Future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And that's really the theme of what I'm talking about, is how do we think about what is the state of the world? How is it distributed? And it's going to turn out, unfortunately, that often the notion of it's typically this, the average is that, is just not well defined. There is really no typical. It depends hugely on how you want to slice it. In this talk, I'm mainly going to slice it in terms of large enterprise networks. That's what I have access to. That's what we do mainly at Corelight. Okay, so, hey, V6, standardized late 90s. How much of this is V6? And I'm going to show you in red how much is V6. And why don't you just picture in your head, what do you think it is? So this is a national laboratory in California. How much V6 out of all this? Here it is. Basically, nothing. Until we get to the weirdos. That started literally one day. All right, what are the weirdos? That is what happens when you add NTP servers to the global NTP pool. Suddenly, everyone wants to talk to you. And this one turns out not to be malice at all. This is just you've offered a global service. The lab has big pipes. The lab is certainly V6 capable, and a whole ton of V6 comes to the lab. Looking at this in terms of how those hosts grow. Now, that is not the world's most happy linear fit because obviously there's a whole bunch of action going on there, and this is log scaled. But roughly 40% a year growth in the hosts, and it's, that's over more than 20 years. And then it shifts for, about 8 years, starts declining. Of course, a lot of these are scanners. We'll get to that in just a sec. And then, of course, we have the weirdos. And then the V6, if you take out the weirdos, the NTP, which is really quite singular, is growing about 20% a year. All right, so if you think about productive connections, those that transfer data in both directions, so were you doing that to weed out scanners, what proportion of the lab's productive connections in late 2023 were V6, and it turns out, well, it's 62%. Most connections. You take out NTP in DNS, and it falls to 2%. And you take out QUIC, and it falls to 1 in 700. So depending how you want to slice that figure, the mental model you have of V6 usage changes hugely. We're going to look a bit at some of the scanning patterns because they illustrate both the notion of steady growth and abrupt growth. And then we'll switch to security technology. So here is over that entire 30 years scanning on Windows ports. And here's the same thing log scaled. And you might be distracted by these horizontal lines you can see kind of embedded in the points. That is when some scanners come and hit the entire address space at the lab, which is either 65K if they find one of the /Bs, or twice that if they find the second /B. So it doesn't have a deep meaning other than it means comprehensive scanning. But it's pretty high. So you've got in 2005, you're talking 1 million a day for most of these, which means it's completely indiscriminate scanning because there's not even 1 million such addresses to scan. Here's a web scanning, and here you can see those horizontal lines I was mentioning better, but you can kind of fit that to, it grows like 26% a year. It's done that ever since like 2003, maybe. And here's some others that have this property. You can't tell when you look at these linear plots, but if you go to log linear, you see they're all plausibly growing exponentially. I've mainly fit to the right-hand side. Okay, so that's a bunch of exponential growth. Here's some that are a little striking, different. So we've got remote shell, network management, SNMP, SIP for telephony, and ChargeN, which is just DDoS. There's no good use for ChargeN today. And all of these just boom. Along came a day and the world shifted and it never went back. Different. And likely the onset of that depends on what did some attackers suddenly get interested in and gear up their immense botnets to go scan. And never lost interest. Here's the last one we'll look at. It's a combo. Here's network time protocol. You can see it gets really big in early 2020s. Off-port TCP, and then, off-port telnet, and then telnet. And those of you who have suffered through Mirai know what this is. Namely, this is the Mirai botnet, which very, very aggressive. So you've got sudden onsets of these protocols, some of which, like 2323, is just strange. It's not really is. And right there was the peak Mirai unhappiness of, hey, every 250 microseconds, a new scan comes for telnet. 4,000 every single second. Within a minute, the entire address space has been scanned, and yet it goes on and on and on and on and on. Okay, that's a look at sort of some of the dynamic patterns in scanning as perceived, mostly indiscriminate scanning, as perceived by enterprise. Let's shift gears, talk about the rise of encryption. This is a topic that us folks who work in network security monitoring are really interested in, because often there is a view of, well, it's all encrypted, so what's the use of analyzing what's on the wire? And there's a couple perspectives on that. One is, well, maybe it's all encrypted, but there's a lot of metadata in the encryption, so get a bunch of information that way. And then maybe it's not all encrypted. How do you get data? And in fact, that question was what drove this entire exploration for me. I wanted to understand via data how to think about this. So the rise of encryption, maybe. And then I've got an asterisk because, as I mentioned earlier, the perspective I'm going to give here is large US enterprises. And it's just going to be different elsewhere. And I'm not making any claims about elsewhere. Okay, let's start with QUIC. Right? So we have this modern protocol, and it is encrypted. And we are told in 2021 that this is just the way it's going, folks. QUIC is going to completely consume the internet. And you've got that line at the bottom there. Hey, in 2020, 3/4 of Facebook's traffic is over this. That's a few years ago now. And I don't doubt it, but is that the view at a modern large enterprise? So looking at Lawrence Berkeley lab data, let's compare log lines per day. So this is essentially what Zeek's able to identify as different connections that are either TLS or QUIC. And starting in 2021, how many do you see? And black is TLS and red is QUIC. So it's clear at the lab that QUIC is not eating the lab. It's not nothing. But TLS grows, those are linear fits now, not exponential. Nearly 5 million connections a year, and QUIC around 2. So if we go to our table here of how many connections at the lab, QUIC's 19%. It's not nothing, but it does not rule the world. Okay, let's look at another question. TLS 1.3. Whole lot of talk among those doing enterprise monitoring about TLS's evolution from 1.2 to 1.3. Why does it matter? Well, 1.3, you can no longer see the certificate. It's part of the exchange that's encrypted. And that means you can't mine it for metadata. The metadata can be really handy if you're trying to do detection. And the SNI, the server name indicator, there are proposals to hide it as well. Currently, it is visible. So we've got this shift from TLS 1.2 to TLS 1.3, and we've got work that's telling us in 2020, whoa, it is just exploding out there. And I know the authors on this. In fact, one of them works with us at Corelight, and the data they have for this is great, huge data at scale. It's just not enterprise data at scale. It's different. And so you can see the rise there, what proportion of the connections are 1.3, in particular TLS 1.3 clients. Back in 2019 was already more than half of the clients. And they say, wow, this is just really surprisingly speedy. It just took 15 months and it's already really dominant back in 2019. So what does this look like? Here's Lawrence Berkeley Lab again. And this plot's a little busy, but I introduced 4 things to plot rather than 2 because an important consideration. So first, what are we seeing? We're seeing in black and green TLS 1.2, and we're seeing in red and blue TLS 1.3. And the reason that it's split is because there's a strong difference in inbound and outbound traffic, which version of TLS it uses. And you can understand that because if you're using like a phone to communicate out from the lab, then it's whatever is in your Chrome on your phone or what's in your iOS browser that's going to pick which TLS to use. And so a single huge vendor can be strongly influential. But for what's coming in, it's different. It's what you run on your own servers plus whatever the clients remotely are. And so how do we interpret this? Well, you see a lot of black and green all the way up till basically April-ish this year. It predominated. It was more popular. And then there's clearly a big level shift happened, presumably, and I haven't done the analysis, Chrome pushed out TLS 1.3, something along those lines. And so if we look at the ratio over time, how are we evolving from 1.2 to 1.3, putting aside that level shift at the end, 8% a year. It's not hugely exploding. It's not all going to be 1.3 next year, that's for sure. It's a process. And we're going to see that about some security technologies, other security technologies. So back to our table. What do we have? How much 1.3 at the end of 2023? I'm going to update this to 2024 in a minute. 39%. So, definitely a player, but not the player. What about SMB? Encrypted SMB, SMB v3. 2012. Hey, there is encrypted SMB. We're calling it SMB3 from now on. By golly, you should use it. 12 years ago. And then in 2016, we're like, just quit it with the SMB v1, folks. It's almost 30 years old. Get rid of it. It is riddled with security issues. At least use 2, and you really ought to use 3. In 2023, how much SMB v3 do we see? None. Now that 0, as opposed to none, because I'm going to fill out other things in this table in a minute, means that there was actually a teeny bit. Right? It wasn't literally none, but it was well below 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000. And then, actually in today, so this is, the data there is 2023, except that footnote is 2024, measured in August. There was more V1 than V3. All right, I've given you a whole bunch of enterprise perspective there. It's just one data point. And you would be completely right to just wonder, is it general? I wondered that. And here I'm able to leverage something crucial we've done at Corelight, which is, because we're in the, analyze traffic, infer stuff about it, detect attacks, stuff like that. And I've done that for decades as a professor and the like. And I know you cannot play that game without real data at scale. You just can't, because whatever you create in your lab has no fidelity to the craziness of actual operational data at scale, and it is crazy. And so at Corelight, a number of years ago, we put together this program, and in the program, we go to some of our customers and deploy alongside their production sensor a research sensor that captures the same traffic, and we ship another crunch box so that we can analyze all the data on-prem, et cetera. And so the point of this is that we have data from multiple enterprises. We have 10 of these partners, and they see a whole lot of data. And one of them is a PCAP. PackRat has 2 petabytes of PCAP, which is just such a nice resource. So we can use this to get some illumination more broadly than one national laboratory. So here is the data from late 2023, and here it is with some of the Polaris sites. And well, what do we see? We see that V6 has very little inroads at them. Quick is a lot less at every single one of them than at LBL. TLS 1.3 is less. And we're kind of thin on the SMB v3, the encrypted SMB. Only one of them has any appreciable traffic. And then those stars were last year more TLS 1.0, old protocol, than 1.3. And those daggers mean, well, they actually had V1. Has this changed? So here is an update. And one of the Polaris sites we didn't have earlier for reasons don't really matter is now included. Here's the new V6. I'm going to summarize this in a minute. Well, here we go. So G, still no V6. Just don't bet long on that one for enterprises. Quick, yeah, some places it matters. At one of those, 54%. So there, it really is kind of predominant. TLS 1.3 is increasing. And SMB is not pretty. And there's still, at a couple of them, more SMB v1 than encrypted. That did shift. The ones that last year didn't have that property, it has actually shifted. And a bunch of v1 at others, even if it doesn't have the property that's more than the v3. All right, so V6 going nowhere. Quick, yeah, it grew over the year, but it's not exploding in enterprises. TLS 1.3 definitely is on the uptake. That one is, it's going to happen, but it's going to take a few years still. And minor growth in encrypted SMB. All right, that's our look at sort of encryption. Please, can it at least be mainly encrypted? A reasonable question, right? So I'm going to show some telemetry here from our sensors. So we have deployed thousands of sensors at Corelight. A number of them, a good chunk, are online and report telemetry to our cloud service, and then a whole bunch are not. And so for the ones that aren't, I have no data. But the ones that are, I have data. So this is aggregate data, log lines per week reported to the cloud service. And you can see it's linear scaled. It goes from up to about, I always have to stop and do the math, 200 billion a week. And black is HTTP and red is TLS. And so you look at this and you think, wait a minute, that's not good. There's more HTTP than TLS. Really not good, and didn't used to be the case. And it turns out, and this is useful to, useful perspective. Here's the same thing log scaled. That is a single customer. They're big, and they have a lot of HTTP. So let's remove them from this analysis because they're obviously skewing it. And there's what it looks like with them removed. And so you've got, there's more TLS than HTTP, but there's HTTP. And let's look at this then as a ratio between the two. And here it is, and it's noisy. It's definitely noisy. But if you're going to fit a line to it, because we want some sort of growth trend, you would say it goes down about 0.6% a year. So way back in 2017, I think when the data starts, it was roughly the fit is 38%, and now it's down to 33% or something. Plenty of HTTP out there. And you might still wonder, well, okay, but there's just going to be a few weirdos like that one I showed, and they're completely full of HTTP, and that's skewing it all. And so here's a different plot. This is every point on here is one of our sensors reporting, and it had at least 100 million HTTP plus TLS. And we're just plotting the ratio of how much HTTP, how much TLS, and put it on there. That's a lot of points. And you can see a huge dynamic spread. You can see some clustering down in the lower right. Good, that's mostly TLS. But you also see stuff well above it that's mostly HTTP. And if you fit to this, least squares, you get about the same thing. It goes down about 0.5% a year. So the takeaway from this is that, things don't always change so quickly. So let me summarize my, my view here that I've been sketching for you. Here is this nice reminder of how malice, namely scanning, can explode. Internet is exploding. It's doing it way back to the left of the entire plot. In the 80s, it's growing exponentially. We get our savior of the internet, V6, in 1996, I believe it is. We remember that TLS 1.0 I was saying? Yep, standardized in pre-2000. The worm era begins. You might see the little thing that little pixel that thing points to. That was the craziness of Code Red when it came out. And this was, oh, wow, it's even worse. Completely crazy scanning. There's our core technology today for TLS from 2008. A little long in the tooth. 2009, Google's like, hey, got to encrypt everywhere. Here is the notions of zero trust. Great notion, just hard. I mean, I think if I want something to sink in, several things to sink in from this talk. One is that the pace, multiple paces are really hard to track. One of them is attacker evolution. A lot of it's steady. Some of it is just incredible bursts. And then for our technology, it's really hard to know. Is this tech, which maybe is just incredibly beneficial, actually going to make a difference anytime soon? What are, the reality is the data speaks. Enterprises find this tech difficult to deliver. There is our, let's finally encrypt SMB. Hey, let's get rid of the bug-ridden SMB. Just a reminder of, receiving 1/3 of the billion scans from a botnet each day. We get 1.3, it's supposed to really sort of deploy and fix a bunch of TLS issues, make TLS more robust. It's deploying really speedily. Quick is just crazy, going to rule the world. And then here we are. Very little V6, Some quick, but a lot of it's trickle. 1.2 still dominates. It's going to lose that over the next few years, according to the data. Boy, encrypted SMB, great idea. It's tough uphill battle to deploy. And amazingly, you get lots of HTTP, and you still get some V1. So that's where I'm going to end it. I will be at the Village for a bit, but not super long because I have to get out to the airport, head home. So if you want to chat, catch me on the early side of the Village. And with that, I'm done. Thank you.